Picture this, it's December 7th, 1958. Church bells are ringing across Portland, Oregon, calling families to Sunday service. Snow dusts the peaks of Mount Hood in the distance, and Christmas is just around the corner. In the Roseway neighborhood of Northeast Portland, at 1715 NE 56th Avenue, the Martin family is preparing for what should have been a simple day trip. Ken Martin, a 54-year-old electrician with gentle eyes and steady hands, is helping his wife Barbara, 48, bundle up their 3 daughters. 14-year-old Barbie, a freshman at Grant High School, rolls the cuffs of her jeans and pulls on her beige coat. 13-year-old Virginia and 11-year-old Susan, excited about the adventure ahead, bounce around the house gathering their things. None of them know that within hours, they will vanish without a trace, launching what would become one of Oregon's most haunting mysteries. None of them know that this ordinary Sunday morning will be their last together as a family. And none of them know that their story will continue to grip people's hearts more than 60 years later. The Martins were what you'd call a typical American family of the 1950s. Ken worked hard at Eccles Electric Home Service Company, providing a steady income that allowed the family to live comfortably in their modest home. Barbara was a devoted mother who kept the household running smoothly. The girls attended local schools and were well liked by their teachers and classmates. The family's eldest child, Donald, was 28 and had already left home. He was a Navy veteran pursuing his graduate studies at Columbia University in New York City, building his own life far from the Pacific Northwest. The night before their disappearance, Ken and Barbara had attended a Christmas party. They returned home in good spirits, already talking about the next day's plans. They wanted to drive out to the Columbia River Gorge, that breathtaking canyon where the mighty Columbia River cuts through the Cascade Mountains, creating one of the most spectacular landscapes in America. Their mission was simple and wholesome: gather greenery to make Christmas wreaths and decorations for their home. It was the kind of family tradition that made the holiday season special, the kind of memory that should have been treasured for years to come. Sunday morning arrived crisp and clear. The family piled into their 1954 Ford Country Squire station wagon, cream-colored with red trim. It was a reliable vehicle, the kind that promised safe travels and happy family adventures. Ken, wearing his tan zip-up jacket and dark slacks, took his place behind the wheel. Barbara, dressed in her navy blue coat over a black print dress and plaid jacket, settled into the passenger seat. The girls, bundled up against the December chill, claimed their spots in the back. As they pulled away from 1715 NE 56th Avenue that late morning, neighbors might have waved from their windows. It was such a normal sight, a family heading out for a Sunday drive, the kind of scene that played out in countless American neighborhoods every weekend. But this time would be different. This time, the Martin family was driving toward a mystery that would haunt Oregon for decades. The Columbia River Gorge has always been a place of stunning beauty and hidden dangers. For thousands of years, it served as a crucial passage for Native American tribes traveling between the Pacific Ocean and the inland regions. Later, it became part of the Oregon Trail, where pioneer families risked everything for a chance at a new life in the West. The gorge is carved by the Columbia River, which flows for more than 1,000 miles from the Canadian Rockies to the Pacific Ocean. Where the river cuts through the Cascade Mountains, it creates a landscape of towering cliffs, rushing waterfalls, and deep, swirling waters. In 1958, the Columbia River Gorge was already a popular destination for day trips from Portland. Families would drive the winding roads to admire the scenery, have picnics, and gather materials for holiday decorations. The area was known for its abundant evergreen trees, holly, and other plants that made perfect Christmas greenery. It seemed like the safest, most innocent kind of family outing. The Martins' journey that day can be traced through a few scattered witness accounts, like breadcrumbs along a path that leads into darkness. Around 4 p.m., roughly 40 miles from their Portland home, they stopped at a gas station in Cascade Locks. Dean Baxter, the proprietor, later remembered selling them 5 gallons of gasoline. He watched as their cream and red station wagon pulled away, continuing east along the Columbia River Highway. Cascade Locks was a small community nestled along the river, named for the locks that once helped boats navigate the treacherous rapids before the Bonneville Dam was built. It was the kind of place where a gas station owner might remember every customer, especially a family like the Martins who stood out with their neat appearance and polite manner. From Cascade Locks, the family drove approximately 20 more miles east to Hood River, a charming town surrounded by orchards and vineyards, with Mount Hood rising majestically to the south. There at the Paradise Snack Bar, they stopped for what would be their last known meal. Clara York, a waitress at the restaurant, later recalled serving the family. She remembered them as pleasant and ordinary, just another family enjoying a Sunday drive. But even as Clara York served them their food, something else was happening in Hood River that day. Two ex-convicts, Roy Light and an unnamed companion, were also in the area. They had stolen a white 1951 Chevrolet from Venice, California, and driven it north. The stolen car would soon be found abandoned in Cascade Locks, and inside it, police would discover a .38 Colt Commander handgun covered in dried blood. At the time, no one connected these two ex-convicts to the Martin family. They were just two more faces in a small town on a Sunday afternoon. But the waiter at the Paradise Snack Bar later told police he saw Roy Light and his companion in the restaurant at the same time as the Martins. Even more unsettling, he said both the ex-convicts and the Martin family left the restaurant at the same time. After leaving Hood River, the Martin family's trail becomes fainter, like footprints disappearing in the sand. Some passing motorists later reported seeing a family that might have been the Martins on the north bank of the Columbia River, across the water in Washington state, at dusk. If these sightings were accurate, it meant the family had crossed the river at some point during their journey. The Columbia River, even in December, is not a river you want to be near after dark. The water is cold and fast-moving, fed by mountain streams and melting snow. The roads along its banks can be treacherous, especially for drivers unfamiliar with the terrain. As evening approached on December 7, 1958, the temperature was dropping and darkness was settling over the gorge. What happened to the Martin family in those final hours of daylight remains one of the most puzzling aspects of their disappearance. They had accomplished their mission, gathering greenery for Christmas decorations. They should have been heading home to Portland, eager to show off their finds and begin decorating for the holiday. Instead, somewhere along the Columbia River, their journey took a dark and inexplicable turn. Back in Portland, Sunday evening passed quietly. The Martin house at 1715 NE 56th Avenue sat dark and empty, waiting for a family that would never return. The washing machine held a load of laundry that Barbara had started before they left. In the kitchen, dishes from their breakfast sat drying on the rack. Everything was exactly as they had left it, preserved like a moment frozen in time. Monday morning, December 8th, brought the first signs that something was terribly wrong. Ken Martin failed to report to his job at Eccles Electric Home Service Company. For a man known for his reliability and strong work ethic, this was completely out of character. Meanwhile, at Grant High School, teachers marked Barbie Martin absent from her morning classes. At Rose City School, Virginia and Susan Martin's teachers did the same. By Monday evening, concern had turned to genuine worry. Taylor Eccles, Ken's boss, made the decision that would officially begin one of Oregon's largest manhunts. He called the police to report the Martin family missing. At approximately 11 p.m., officers arrived at the Martin home on NE 56th Avenue to begin their investigation. What they found inside the house only deepened the mystery. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication of foul play within the home itself. Everything appeared normal, as if the family had simply stepped out for a few hours and would be back at any moment. Barbara's washing sat unfinished in the machine. The breakfast dishes remained on the drying rack. The family's bank accounts held substantial savings, ruling out financial desperation as a motive for disappearance. Most telling of all, the house felt lived in and loved. Family photographs smiled down from the walls. Christmas preparations were already underway, with decorations partially arranged around the house. This was clearly a family that had been planning for the future, not preparing to vanish from the face of the earth. The police investigation began immediately, but the trail was already growing cold. Officers from both Multnomah County, where the Martin family lived, and Hood River County, where they were last seen, joined the search effort. They retraced the family's known route, interviewing witnesses and looking for any clue that might explain what had happened to 5 people and their station wagon. The search quickly revealed disturbing details that suggested this was no ordinary missing persons case. The abandoned stolen Chevrolet found in Cascade Locks was concerning enough, but the discovery of the bloodied handgun nearby raised even more questions. When police traced the gun's serial number, they made a shocking discovery. The weapon had been among several sporting goods items that Donald Martin, the family's eldest son, had been accused of stealing from a Meier and Frank department store 2 years earlier while working there. This revelation sent investigators down a troubling path of speculation. Was there some connection between Donald's past troubles and his family's disappearance? Was the appearance of this specific gun near the site of the stolen car more than just a coincidence? The fact that Donald was thousands of miles away in New York City, verifiably enrolled at Columbia University, only deepened the mystery. Meanwhile, the arrest of Roy Light and his unnamed companion for car theft added another layer of complexity to the case. The timing was impossible to ignore. An abandoned stolen car, a bloodied gun with connections to the Martin family, 2 ex-convicts arrested the day after the family's disappearance, and witness reports placing both the criminals and the Martins in the same restaurant at the same time. But as investigators tried to piece together these seemingly connected elements, they found themselves grasping at shadows. Roy Light and his companion claimed no knowledge of the Martin family. The gun, despite its disturbing connection to Donald's past, yielded no clear evidence linking it to the current disappearance. The stolen car appeared to be completely unrelated to the missing Ford Country Squire. As December stretched on, tips and reported sightings poured into police headquarters. More than 200 letters arrived, along with hundreds of phone calls from concerned citizens across the Pacific Northwest and beyond. Each lead was followed up, each sighting investigated, but none provided the breakthrough that investigators desperately needed. One of the most promising leads came from an orchard owner east of Portland, who reported seeing a man and woman on December 7th gathering greenery in a canyon that was known to contain a Native American burial ground. He added a chilling detail. The following week, he had noticed buzzards circling in that area. When police searched the canyon, they found nothing, but the image of those circling buzzards would haunt investigators for years to come. Other reported sightings seemed to suggest the family might still be alive, but on the run. A woman's glove found near the abandoned Chevrolet was described by family members as similar to one Barbara would wear, though it could not be definitively identified as hers. On New Year's Eve, a man called police claiming he had seen a vehicle matching the Martins' Ford speeding south on the Baldock Freeway. Despite police alerts along the route, the car was never located. Perhaps most intriguing was a letter from a witness who claimed to have seen a family resembling the Martins in Burlington, Iowa, on Christmas Eve. For a brief moment, this sighting offered hope that the family might be alive, perhaps having fled Oregon for reasons unknown. But like so many other leads, this one also led nowhere. The last reported sighting of the Ford Country Squire came on January 7, 1959, exactly 1 month after the family's disappearance. A truck driver claimed he had seen a car matching the Martins' description parked in Billings, Montana, complete with Oregon license plates. Once again, investigators followed up, but the lead evaporated like morning mist. As winter turned to spring in 1959, the search for the Martin family expanded beyond simple police work. volunteer searchers combed the forests and mountains around the Columbia River Gorge. The Portland metropolitan area was searched systematically. Even the slopes of Mount Hood were examined for any sign of the missing family. Then, in February, a volunteer searcher made a discovery that changed everything. Near the Dalles, approximately 70 miles east of Portland, tire tracks were found leading off a cliff toward the Columbia River. The tracks appeared to match the tires on the Martins Ford Country Squire. Even more significant, paint chips recovered at the scene were sent to the Federal Bureau of Investigation for analysis. The FBI's conclusion was both encouraging and terrifying. The paint chips matched the exact paint used on Ford Country Squire station wagons of the same year and color as the Martins' vehicle. For the first time since the family's disappearance, investigators had physical evidence that might explain their fate. The implications were stark. If the tire tracks and paint chips belonged to the Martin family's car, it suggested their vehicle had gone off the cliff and into the Columbia River. The area where the tracks were found was directly across from an aluminum smelting plant, and the river there was known to be particularly deep and treacherous. This discovery prompted an unprecedented response. The United States Army Corps of Engineers was called in to help with the search. They lowered the level of the Columbia River by 5 feet in the lake behind Bonneville Dam, hoping to make it easier to search the river bottom. Sonar technology, cutting edge for 1959, was deployed to scan the murky depths. But the Columbia River, it seemed, was determined to keep its secrets. Despite the massive search effort, the advanced technology, and the lowered water level, nothing was found. The river bottom yielded no trace of a 1954 Ford Country Squire, no sign of the 5 people who might be trapped within its depths. On May 1, 1959, nearly 5 months after the Martin family's disappearance, a river drilling rig working near the Dalles made a disturbing discovery. The rig's anchor hooked onto something of substantial weight on the river bottom. Whatever it was heavy enough to strain the equipment and large enough to seem significant. But before the object could be brought to the surface, it broke free and sank back into the dark waters. The timing of this incident would prove to be tragically significant. The very next morning, May 2nd, a fisherman and his wife were out on the Columbia River near Cascade Locks when they spotted what appeared to be 2 bodies floating downstream. The couple followed the bodies as they drifted toward Bonneville Dam, watching in horror as the river carried them along. On May 3rd, the first body washed ashore near Camas, Washington, roughly 70 miles downstream from where the tire tracks had been found near the Dalles. It was the body of 11-year-old Susan Martin, the youngest member of the missing family. Her identity was confirmed through dental records, bringing both relief and heartbreak to investigators who had been searching for any trace of the family for nearly 5 months. The next morning, May 4th, Virginia Martin's body was discovered near Bonneville Dam, about 46 miles downstream from the Dalles. Like her younger sister, 13-year-old Virginia was positively identified through dental records. The 2 girls had been found roughly 30 miles apart, both having traveled dozens of miles downstream from where investigators believed their family's car had entered the water. The discovery of Susan and Virginia's bodies should have provided answers, but instead, it only raised more disturbing questions. When the bodies were taken to the Clark County Medical Examiner's office and then transferred to Multnomah County for autopsy, one of the technicians made a shocking observation. While taking fingerprints before the official examination, the technician believed he saw what appeared to be bullet holes in both girls' heads. This observation sent shockwaves through the investigation. If the girls had been shot, it would completely change the nature of the case from a tragic accident to a multiple homicide. But when the official autopsies were performed, the medical examiner found no evidence of gunshot wounds. The cause of death for both Susan and Virginia was listed as drowning. The discrepancy between the technician's initial observation and the medical examiner's official findings became one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. Had the technician been mistaken, seeing wounds that weren't there in the stress and confusion of the moment? Or had something been missed or covered up during the official examination? Adding to the mystery was the discovery of traces of aluminum on Susan's clothing. This detail would later seem significant when investigators noted that the area where the tire tracks led into the river was directly across from an aluminum smelting plant. The aluminum traces suggested that Susan's body had indeed spent time in that specific area of the river. Sheriff Rupert Gilmouth of Hood River County developed his own theory about what had happened. He believed that the drilling rig's disturbance of the river bottom on May 1st had dislodged the Martin family's car, causing it to shift position and allowing one of the doors to open. This would explain how Susan and Virginia's bodies were able to escape the vehicle and surface downstream, while the car and the rest of the family remained trapped on the river bottom. It was a plausible theory that seemed to fit the available evidence. The timing of the drilling rig incident, followed immediately by the appearance of the two bodies, was too significant to be mere coincidence. But like so many aspects of the Martin family case, this theory raised as many questions as it answered. If Gilmouth's theory was correct, and the car was indeed on the river bottom with Ken Martin, Barbara Martin, and 14-year-old Barbie still trapped inside, why couldn't searchers locate it? Even with sonar technology and lowered river levels, the vehicle remained elusive. The Columbia River, it seemed, was vast enough and deep enough to swallow a station wagon and 3 people without a trace. The search efforts continued throughout the summer of 1959, but with decreasing intensity and hope. The discovery of Susan and Virginia's bodies had confirmed that something terrible had happened to the Martin family, but the exact nature of that tragedy remained unclear. Were they victims of a tragic accident, driving off the cliff in the darkness of a December evening? Or had they met with foul play, their car pushed into the river after they had been killed? The search was finally suspended after a diving accident nearly claimed the life of one of the searchers. The Columbia River had already taken too much. Investigators were not willing to risk additional lives in pursuit of answers that seemed increasingly elusive. As 1959 drew to a close, the Martin family case settled into the category of unsolved mysteries. The house at 1715 NE 56th Avenue stood empty, a monument to a family that had simply vanished. Christmas decorations that were never completed gathered dust in closets. Bank accounts that were never emptied continued to earn interest on money that no one would ever claim. But perhaps the most heartbreaking detail of all was what happened to the cremated remains of Susan and Virginia Martin. After their autopsies were completed and their bodies released, they were cremated and placed in urns at the Riverview Abbey Mausoleum in Portland. For more than a decade, those urns sat unclaimed, 2 little girls waiting for a family that would never come for them. On December 29, 1969, the girls' paternal grandmother, Margaret Martin, passed away. The very next day, as funeral arrangements were being made for Margaret, someone retrieved the urns containing Susan and Virginia's remains. To this day, no one knows who took the girls' ashes or where they were finally laid to rest. It was as if the Martin family was disappearing piece by piece, even in death. By the 1970s, the Martin family disappearance had become part of Oregon folklore. Older residents of Portland still remembered the case, still wondered what had happened to that nice family from the Roseway neighborhood. But as years passed and new tragedies captured public attention, the Martins gradually faded from active memory. Donald Martin, the only surviving member of the family, inherited what was left of the family estate in 1966 after 7 years of probate proceedings. The inheritance was modest: the house, some savings, and the personal effects of a family that had been preparing for Christmas when they disappeared. Donald eventually moved to Hawaii, where he became a teacher at James Campbell High School. He built a new life for himself in the Pacific Islands, far from the Columbia River Gorge where his family had vanished. Donald never gave up hope of learning what had happened to his parents and sisters. Throughout his life, he stayed in touch with investigators, always willing to provide information or assistance if it might help solve the case. But answers never came. Donald Martin died in October 2004 at the age of 73, taking with him the last living connection to the family that had disappeared on that December day in 1958. For decades after Donald's death, the Martin family case remained dormant. Police files gathered dust in storage rooms. The Columbia River continued its relentless journey to the sea, keeping its secrets buried in silt and shadow. The case seemed destined to remain one of Oregon's greatest unsolved mysteries, a puzzle with pieces that would never fit together. But the Columbia River, it turns out, cannot keep secrets forever. And sometimes, the most important discoveries come not from official investigations or high-tech equipment, but from individuals who refuse to let go of the past. Sometimes the truth surfaces in the most unexpected ways, carried to light by currents that have been flowing in darkness for more than 60 years. In late 2024, an independent diver named Archer Mayo was exploring the depths of the Columbia River near Cascade Locks. Mayo had become fascinated by the Martin family case and was conducting his own underwater investigation, using modern diving equipment and techniques that weren't available in 1959. The river that had frustrated searchers for decades was about to give up at least some of its secrets. What Archer Mayo found on the river bottom would reignite interest in the Martin family disappearance and provide the first concrete evidence in more than half a century. Buried beneath rock, silt, and debris, approximately 50 feet below the water's surface, Mayo discovered what appeared to be the remains of a vehicle. Not just any vehicle, but one that matched the description of the Martins' 1954 Ford Country Squire station wagon. The discovery sent shockwaves through the Pacific Northwest. After 66 years of mystery, the Martin family's car had apparently been found. But as recovery efforts began in March 2025, investigators knew that finding the vehicle was only the beginning. The real questions, what had happened to the family, how they had ended up in the river, and whether Ken, Barbara, and Barbie Martin's remains were still inside, remained unanswered. As portions of the vehicle were carefully extracted from the river bottom and sent to the Oregon State Crime Laboratory for examination, the investigation into the Martin family disappearance was officially reopened. Modern forensic techniques that didn't exist in 1959 would now be applied to evidence that had been waiting on the river bottom for more than 6 decades. The discovery of the car vindicated investigators like Detective Walter Graven, who had died in 1988, still believing that the family had met with foul play and that their murders would be solved once their vehicle was found. Sheriff Rupert Gilmouth's theory about the drilling rig dislodging the car and allowing Susan and Virginia's bodies to escape seemed to be supported by the vehicle's location and condition. But even as the car was being recovered, new questions emerged. If this was indeed the Martin family's vehicle, how had it remained hidden for so long in waters that had been searched extensively? What condition were the remains inside, if any? And most importantly, would the car finally provide answers to the questions that had haunted Oregon for more than half a century? The Columbia River has witnessed countless tragedies throughout its long history. Native American legends speak of spirits dwelling in its depths, and pioneer journals tell of wagons lost to its treacherous currents. But few mysteries have gripped the Pacific Northwest like the disappearance of the Martin family. As we delve deeper into this haunting case, we find ourselves confronting questions that challenge our understanding of what really happened on that December evening in 1958. The recovery of what appears to be the Martin family's Ford Country Squire station wagon in late 2024 marked a pivotal moment in a case that had remained unsolved for over 6 decades. But as investigators began the painstaking process of examining the vehicle and its contents, they discovered that finding the car raised more questions than it answered. The Columbia River, it seemed, was finally ready to share some of its secrets, but those secrets came with their own mysteries. Archer Mayo, the independent diver who made the discovery, had spent years researching the Martin family case. Unlike the searchers in 1959 who were working with primitive sonar and limited diving technology, Mayo had access to modern equipment that could penetrate the river's murky depths with unprecedented clarity. His dedication to solving the mystery had led him to explore areas of the Columbia River that had been searched before, but never with such advanced techniques. When Mayo first spotted the outline of a vehicle buried beneath decades of silt and debris, he knew immediately that he might have found something significant. The location was roughly consistent with where investigators in 1959 had theorized the Martin car might have entered the water, near the Dalles where tire tracks had been found leading off the cliff. But the vehicle was much deeper than anyone had expected, buried under layers of sediment that had accumulated over more than half a century. The process of confirming that this was indeed the Martin family's car required careful documentation and expert analysis. The vehicle's make, model, and color appeared to match the missing Ford Country Squire, but definitive identification would require examination of serial numbers, vehicle identification numbers, and other unique identifiers. The harsh underwater environment had taken its toll on the car, with decades of river water, silt, and debris obscuring many of the details that would normally make identification straightforward. As word of the discovery spread, it reignited public interest in the Martin family case. Newspapers across Oregon and beyond picked up the story, and social media buzzed with speculation about what the car might reveal. For many older residents of Portland who remembered the original disappearance, the news brought back vivid memories of the massive search effort and the community's collective hope that the family might somehow be found alive. The recovery operation that began in March 2025 was a delicate and complex undertaking. The vehicle was located approximately 50 feet below the surface, in water that was cold, dark, and filled with debris. Recovery divers had to work carefully to avoid disturbing potential evidence, while also dealing with the challenging conditions of the Columbia River. The strong current that had likely carried Susan and Virginia Martin's bodies downstream in 1959 continued to make diving operations dangerous. Using a vacuum dredge, investigators began the slow process of removing the silt and debris that had accumulated around and inside the vehicle. Each bucket of mud and sediment was carefully sifted for any evidence that might shed light on what had happened to the Martin family. The work was methodical and time-consuming, but it represented the first real progress in the case since the discovery of the girls' bodies in 1959. As portions of the vehicle were brought to the surface, the full magnitude of what had been preserved beneath the river became apparent. The chassis, rear axle, and engine were extracted and immediately transporting to the Oregon State Crime Laboratory for detailed examination. Modern forensic techniques that were unimaginable in 1959 would now be applied to evidence that had been waiting underwater for more than 6 decades. The laboratory analysis began with the basic task of confirming the vehicle's identity. Vehicle identification numbers, engine serial numbers, and other unique markers would be compared against records from 1958 to determine definitively whether this was the Martin family's missing Ford Country Squire. But even as this fundamental question was being answered, investigators knew that more complex questions lay ahead. If this was indeed the Martin car, what condition were any human remains that might be inside? The acidic conditions of river water, combined with decades of sediment accumulation, would have affected both metal and organic materials. Advanced forensic techniques might be able to identify bone fragments or other human remains even after such an extended period underwater, but the process would be painstaking and might not yield definitive results. Even more challenging was the question of how the car had ended up in the river. The tire tracks found near the Dalles in 1959 had suggested that the vehicle had gone off the cliff, but the physical evidence from the recovered car might tell a different story. Impact patterns on the vehicle, the position in which it was found, and the distribution of debris could all provide clues about whether the car had accidentally driven off the cliff or had been deliberately pushed. The location where the car was found also provided important information about the river's behavior in 1958. The Columbia River has been significantly altered since the Martin family's disappearance, with new dams, modified water levels, and changed flow patterns. Understanding how the river behaved in December 1958 would be crucial to interpreting the evidence from the recovered vehicle. One of the most intriguing aspects of the car's discovery was how it had remained hidden for so long. The area where it was found had been searched multiple times in 1959, using the best sonar technology available at the time. The United States Army Corps of Engineers had even lowered the river level by 5 feet to make searching easier. How had such an extensive search effort missed a station wagon sitting on the river bottom? The answer lay partly in the river's geography and behavior. The Columbia River near the Dalles is not a simple, smooth-bottomed channel. Instead, it's a complex underwater landscape of rocks, debris, and sediment deposits that can easily hide large objects. Over the decades, the Martin car had become buried under layers of silt, making it virtually invisible to sonar searches and underwater cameras. Only Mayo's systematic exploration with modern equipment had been able to penetrate these layers and identify the vehicle beneath. But the car's concealment raised troubling questions about the original search effort. If the vehicle had been missed in 1959, what other evidence might have been overlooked? Were there other clues on the river bottom that could have solved the case decades earlier? The limitations of 1950s search technology meant that investigators had been working with incomplete information, potentially leading them down wrong paths or missing crucial evidence. As the laboratory analysis of the recovered vehicle continued, investigators began revisiting other aspects of the case with fresh eyes. The mysterious handgun found near the abandoned stolen Chevrolet in 1958 was re-examined in light of modern forensic techniques. The weapon had never been processed for fingerprints or DNA evidence in 1958, and those scientific methods were either primitive or non-existent at the time. Could modern analysis of this decades-old evidence provide new insights? The gun's connection to Donald Martin, the family's eldest son, had always been one of the most puzzling aspects of the case. Donald had been accused of stealing sporting goods from the Meyer and Frank department store where he worked, including the handgun that was later found covered in blood near the scene of his family's disappearance. But Donald had been thousands of miles away in New York City when his family vanished, with ironclad alibis that placed him at Columbia University. The coincidence of this specific weapon appearing at the scene of his family's disappearance seemed too significant to ignore, yet investigators had never been able to establish any meaningful connection. Was it possible that someone had deliberately placed the gun there to implicate Donald or confuse the investigation? Or was it simply one of those strange coincidences that make real life stranger than fiction? The arrest of Roy Light and his unnamed companion for stealing the Chevrolet had also never been satisfactorily resolved. The timing of their presence in the area, their criminal backgrounds, and the witness account placing them in the same restaurant as the Martin family at the same time created a compelling circumstantial case. Yet neither man had ever been charged in connection with the Martin family's disappearance, and both had maintained their innocence. Modern investigative techniques might be able to shed new light on these decades-old questions. DNA analysis of the bloodied handgun, if any genetic material had survived, could potentially identify whose blood had been on the weapon. Advanced forensic accounting might reveal connections between the criminals and the Martin family that weren't apparent in 1958. Cold case investigators with fresh perspectives might spot patterns or relationships that had been missed by their predecessors. The psychological impact of the Martin family's disappearance on the Portland community had been profound and long-lasting. In 1958, such cases were relatively rare, and the idea that an entire family could simply vanish without explanation challenged people's sense of safety and security. The massive search effort had brought the community together, with volunteers from across Oregon joining the hunt for the missing family. Local newspapers had covered every development in the case, from the initial disappearance through the discovery of the girls' bodies and the suspension of the search effort. The coverage reflected the era's more formal journalistic style, but the emotional impact of the story came through clearly in the headlines and articles. Family of 5 vanishes without trace. Desperate search continues for missing Portland family. River yields bodies of Martin girls. These headlines captured a community's growing despair as hope turned to grief. The impact on the Martin family's neighborhood was particularly intense. Residents of the Roseway area had watched the search efforts, held vigils, and struggled to understand how such a tragedy could strike so close to home. The empty house at 1715 NE 56th Avenue became a daily reminder of the family that had simply disappeared. Children who had played with Barbie, Virginia, and Susan Martin were left to wonder what had happened to their friends. Schools where the Martin children had been students also felt the impact deeply. Teachers who had marked the girls absent on December 9, 1958, not knowing they would never see their students again, carried that memory for the rest of their lives. Classmates grew up with the knowledge that their friends had vanished, creating a generation of Portland residents who would never forget the Martin family case. The broader cultural impact of the disappearance reflected the changing nature of American society in the late 1950s. The post-World War II era had brought unprecedented prosperity and optimism, with families like the Martins enjoying comfortable middle-class lives and the promise of an even better future. The idea that such a family could simply disappear challenged the assumptions of suburban safety that defined the era. The case also highlighted the limitations of law enforcement and search technology in the 1950s. While police were dedicated and thorough, they lacked many of the tools that modern investigators take for granted. There was no nationwide database of missing persons, no DNA analysis, and no advanced underwater search equipment. Communication between different jurisdictions was limited, making it difficult to coordinate searches or share information quickly. The media coverage of the Martin case reflected these limitations as well. Television news was still in its infancy, and most people relied on newspapers and radio for information about the search effort. The absence of instantaneous communication meant that tips and sightings often took days to reach investigators, reducing their value significantly. In today's world of social media and instant communication, the same case might have unfolded very differently. Religious communities across Portland also grappled with the Martin family's disappearance. The family's Sunday trip to gather Christmas greenery seemed like such an innocent, wholesome activity that their disappearance raised fundamental questions about divine protection and the nature of tragedy. Churches held special services and prayer vigils, seeking both comfort for the community and divine intervention in the search effort. The Christmas season of 1958 was particularly difficult for many Portland families. The Martin family's mission to gather holiday decorations made their disappearance seem especially poignant during what should have been a time of celebration and family togetherness. Many families reported that their own Christmas celebrations felt hollow and subdued, overshadowed by thoughts of the missing family. As months passed without resolution, the Martin case began to take on elements of urban legend and folklore. Stories circulated about mysterious sightings, unexplained phenomena near the Columbia River, and theories about what might have happened to the family. Some of these stories were based on genuine witness accounts, while others grew from rumor and speculation. The absence of definitive answers created a vacuum that imagination and fear rushed to fill. The case also attracted the attention of amateur investigators and armchair detectives who developed their own theories about what had happened. Some focused on the criminal connections, believing that Roy Light and his companion held the key to solving the mystery. Others suspected that the family had been victims of a random crime, perhaps encountering dangerous individuals while gathering greenery in remote areas along the river. More exotic theories suggested that the family had witnessed something they shouldn't have and been eliminated to protect powerful interests. The Cold War paranoia of the era contributed to speculation about government cover-ups or foreign agents. While these theories lacked credible evidence, they reflected the community's struggle to understand how 5 people could simply disappear without explanation. The discovery of Susan and Virginia's bodies in May 1959 had provided some answers, but also raised new questions. The controversial observation by the fingerprint technician about possible bullet wounds in the girls' heads continued to fuel speculation about murder versus accidental death. The official finding that both girls had drowned was accepted by some, but questioned by others who wondered if the truth had been suppressed. The aluminum traces found on Susan's clothing provided a tantalizing clue that seemed to support the theory that the car had gone into the river near the aluminum smelting plant. But this evidence also raised questions about how long the girls' bodies had been in the water and what path they had taken downstream. The Columbia River's complex currents and underwater topography made it difficult to trace the body's journey with certainty. The timing of the drilling rig incident on May 1st, followed immediately by the appearance of the bodies, seemed too coincidental to ignore. Sheriff Rupert Gilmouth's theory that the rig had disturbed the car and allowed the doors to open made logical sense, but it also implied that the vehicle had been sitting on the river bottom in a relatively intact state. If that was the case, why couldn't searchers locate it even after they knew approximately where to look? The suspension of the underwater search after a diver nearly drowned highlighted the dangerous conditions in the Columbia River. The same fast-moving currents and treacherous underwater terrain that made searching difficult had likely played a role in the Martin family's fate. Even experienced divers with modern equipment found the river challenging. For a family in a station wagon on a December evening, the water would have been absolutely lethal. The years following the suspension of the active search saw periodic attempts to revive interest in the case. New investigative techniques, changing personnel in law enforcement, and occasional new tips or theories would prompt brief renewals of activity. But without significant new evidence, these efforts typically faded quickly, leaving the case to gather dust in filing cabinets and storage rooms. The 1960s brought social and cultural changes that shifted public attention away from unsolved mysteries like the Martin case. The civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, and generational conflicts captured headlines and public imagination. While older residents of Portland still remembered the missing family, younger generations grew up knowing the case only as a historical footnote. Donald Martin's inheritance of the family estate in 1966 marked another milestone in the case's evolution from active investigation to historical mystery. The probate process had taken 7 years, reflecting both the legal complexities of declaring missing persons dead and the hope that the family might somehow still be found alive. When Donald finally received his modest inheritance, it represented the legal system's acknowledgement that his parents and sisters were presumed dead. Donald's subsequent move to Hawaii and Korea as a teacher showed remarkable resilience in the face of unimaginable loss. He had lost his entire family in a single day, yet he had managed to build a new life for himself thousands of miles from the scene of the tragedy. His decision to become a teacher seemed particularly meaningful, suggesting a desire to nurture and guide young people in honor of his sisters who had never had the chance to grow up. Throughout his life in Hawaii, Donald maintained contact with investigators and researchers interested in his family's case. He provided information when asked, answered questions from journalists and amateur investigators, and never gave up hope that someday he might learn what had really happened. His cooperation with various inquiries over the decades showed both his dedication to finding the truth and his remarkable grace under pressure. The retrieval of Susan and Virginia's cremated remains in 1969 added another layer of mystery to the case. The timing, occurring just one day after their paternal grandmother's death, while funeral arrangements were being made, suggested that whoever took the urns had inside knowledge of the family's situation. But the identity of this person and the final resting place of the girl's ashes remained unknown, adding a melancholy footnote to an already tragic story. The 1970s and 1980s saw sporadic media coverage of the Martin case, typically on anniversaries of the disappearance or when new investigative techniques raised the possibility of fresh leads. Television documentaries about unsolved mysteries occasionally featured the case, introducing it to national audiences who hadn't been familiar with the story. These programs often emphasized the more sensational aspects of the case: the mysterious gun, the criminal connections, the conflicting theories about accident versus murder. Detective Walter Graven's continued belief that the case would be solved once the car was found proved to be prescient, though he didn't live to see his prediction come true. Graven's dedication to the case throughout his career reflected the personal investment that many investigators develop in unsolved cases. His conviction that the family had been murdered rather than accidentally killed kept the possibility of criminal charges alive even as the case grew cold. The development of new forensic techniques throughout the late 20th century periodically raised hopes that the Martin case might be solved. DNA analysis, advanced computer modeling, and sophisticated underwater search equipment all seemed to offer possibilities that hadn't existed in 1958. But without new evidence to analyze, these technological advances couldn't move the investigation forward. The rise of the internet in the 1990s brought new attention to cold cases like the Martin family disappearance. Online forums and amateur detective communities began discussing the case, sharing theories, and analyzing evidence that had been gathered decades earlier. The Charlie Project and other missing persons websites made information about the case widely available, introducing new generations to the mystery. Margie Boulet's organized dive search in 1999 represented one of the most significant attempts to revive the investigation since the original search effort. As a journalist for The Oregonian, Boulet had the resources and connections to organize a professional underwater search using modern equipment. The fact that her search was unsuccessful only added to the mystery of why the car couldn't be found despite numerous attempts with increasingly sophisticated technology. The new millennium brought continued interest in the case from both amateur investigators and law enforcement professionals. Cold case units, which had become more common in police departments across the country, occasionally reviewed the Martin file to see if new techniques might yield fresh insights. But without new evidence or witnesses, these reviews typically confirmed what investigators had long suspected, without providing the breakthrough needed to solve the case. The death of Donald Martin in 2004 marked the end of the last direct connection to the missing family. His passing was noted in Hawaiian newspapers, where he was remembered as a dedicated teacher who had overcome personal tragedy to build a meaningful life. But his death also meant that there was no longer anyone alive who could provide first-hand information about the family's dynamics, habits, or possible reasons for their disappearance. Donald's burial at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, alongside his wife, provided a peaceful conclusion to his personal story. But it also highlighted the fact that he was the only member of the Martin family to receive a proper burial in a known location. His parents and sisters remained missing, their final resting place unknown despite decades of searching. The years following Donald's death saw continued but sporadic interest in the case. True crime enthusiasts, documentary filmmakers, and amateur investigators continued to examine the evidence and propose new theories. The advent of social media platforms created new venues for discussing the case and sharing information, though it also contributed to the spread of misinformation and unfounded speculation. As the case approached its 50th anniversary in 2008, several media outlets produced retrospective coverage that introduced the story to new audiences. These articles and television segments often focused on the case's enduring mysteries and the technological advances that might finally provide answers. But without new evidence, the coverage inevitably concluded with the same unanswered questions that had puzzled investigators for decades. The 60th anniversary of the disappearance in 2018 prompted another wave of media attention, including a documentary by KOIN News that examined the case in detail. This coverage benefited from improved access to historical records and the ability to interview surviving witnesses and investigators. But like previous retrospectives, it ultimately served to highlight how little progress had been made in solving the case despite the passage of 6 decades. It was against this backdrop of renewed interest that Archer Mayo began his independent investigation of the Columbia River near Cascade Locks. Mayo's background and motivation for undertaking such a challenging search remain part of the story's ongoing mystery. His success in finding what appears to be the Martin family's car, where professional searchers had failed for more than 60 years, raises questions about both his methods and the limitations of earlier search efforts. The discovery of the car in 2024 and its recovery in 2025 have opened a new chapter in the Martin family case, but they have also highlighted how much remains unknown about what happened on December 7, 1958. The vehicle may provide crucial forensic evidence about the family's fate, but it may also raise new questions about the circumstances of their disappearance. As investigators continue their examination of the recovered vehicle and its contents, the Martin family case stands at a crossroads between its tragic past and an uncertain future. The answers that have eluded investigators for more than 6 decades may finally be within reach, hidden in the twisted metal and accumulated sediment of a Ford Country Squire station wagon that spent 66 years on the bottom of the Columbia River. The scientific analysis of the recovered vehicle will likely take months or even years to complete. Modern forensic techniques can extract extraordinary amounts of information from even heavily degraded evidence, but the process is painstaking and often inconclusive. The harsh underwater environment may have preserved some types of evidence while destroying others, creating a complex puzzle for investigators to piece together. But even if the recovered car provides definitive answers about how the Martin family died, it may never explain why they were in that particular location at that particular time. The human story behind the tragedy, the decisions, circumstances, and perhaps criminal actions that led to 5 people driving or being driven off a cliff into the Columbia River, may remain as mysterious as ever. The Martin family's story has become woven into the cultural fabric of Oregon, a reminder of how quickly ordinary lives can be touched by extraordinary tragedy. Their disappearance represents not just a criminal case or a missing persons investigation, but a fundamental disruption of the natural order. Parents and children who should have lived long, full lives together, but instead vanished in a single moment on a December evening. As we prepare to examine the final chapter of this decades-long mystery, we must remember that behind all the forensic evidence, investigative theories, and media coverage are 5 real people who left home on a Sunday morning and never returned. Ken and Barbara Martin were parents who wanted to create beautiful Christmas memories for their daughters. Barbie, Virginia, and Susan were young girls excited about helping to decorate their home for the holidays. Their story deserves to be remembered not just as a fascinating mystery, but as a human tragedy that touched countless lives and changed a community forever. The Columbia River continues its ancient journey to the sea, carrying the secrets of the past along with the hopes of the present. Soon, it may finally reveal what happened to the Martin family on that dark December night in 1958. But regardless of what the river tells us, the Martin family's legacy will live on in the memories of those who knew them and in the hearts of those who have never stopped searching for the truth. The Oregon State Crime Laboratory had seen countless pieces of evidence over the decades, but few arrivals generated as much anticipation as the corroded metal fragments pulled from the Columbia River in March 2025. For 67 years, the Martin family case had haunted investigators, journalists, and amateur sleuths. Now, twisted pieces of steel and aluminum that had spent more than half a century underwater might finally provide the answers that had remained so elusive. Dr. Sarah Chen, the laboratory's chief forensic analyst, approached the Martin evidence with both scientific rigor and deep awareness of its historical significance. She had studied the case files extensively, understanding that her analysis might not only solve one of Oregon's most enduring mysteries, but also bring closure to a community that had never forgotten the missing family. The weight of that responsibility was not lost on her as she began her examination. The first task was definitively confirming that the recovered vehicle was indeed the Martin family's 1954 Ford Country Squire. Decades of river water had corroded much of the metal, but certain identification points remained intact. The vehicle identification number, etched into the frame in a location designed to survive even severe damage, matched the records from 1958. Serial numbers on engine components, though heavily corroded, were still partially readable and consistent with the missing car's specifications. But even as Dr. Chen confirmed the vehicle's identity, she discovered something that challenged fundamental assumptions about the case. The pattern of damage to the car was not consistent with a vehicle that had simply driven off a cliff and plunged into the river. Instead, the evidence suggested a more complex and disturbing sequence of events. The front of the vehicle showed impact damage that was consistent with a collision, but not with hitting water or rocks at the bottom of the river. Instead, the damage patterns suggested that the car had struck something solid while traveling at moderate speed, perhaps another vehicle or a fixed object. More troubling still, the driver's side door showed clear evidence of having been forced open from the outside, with metal bent in patterns that indicated external pressure rather than internal attempts to escape. Dr. Chen's analysis revealed other disturbing details. Paint transfers on the rear bumper indicated that another vehicle had made contact with the Ford, consistent with the car being pushed rather than driven. The positions of the seats and steering wheel, preserved by their underwater burial, suggested that the car had been occupied when it entered the water, but the occupants had not been in normal driving or passenger positions. Perhaps most significantly, the pattern of silt accumulation inside the vehicle told a story of how it had filled with water and sediment over the decades. This analysis revealed that the car had not gone into the river intact. Instead, several windows had been broken before the vehicle entered the water, allowing for rapid flooding that would have made escape impossible for anyone trapped inside. As Dr. Chen compiled her findings, a dark picture began to emerge. The Martin family's Ford Country Squire had not accidentally driven off a cliff into the Columbia River. Instead, all evidence pointed to a deliberate act. The family's car had been pushed into the water after its occupants had been killed or incapacitated. The case that had puzzled investigators for 67 years was not a tragic accident, but a carefully planned multiple murder. This revelation transformed everything about the Martin family case. The mysterious circumstances surrounding their disappearance, the stolen car, the bloodied gun, the presence of ex-convicts in the area suddenly took on new significance. What had seemed like coincidences now appeared to be pieces of a criminal conspiracy that had succeeded in hiding the truth for more than 6 decades. The discovery of human remains inside the recovered vehicle confirmed Dr. Chen's worst suspicions. Skeletal remains of 3 individuals were found in positions that strongly suggested they had been placed in the car after death. The remains showed clear evidence of trauma consistent with violent deaths, including damage that could only have been caused by bullets or blunt force weapons. Modern DNA analysis, impossible in 1958, allowed investigators to definitively identify the remains as those of Kenneth Martin, Barbara Martin, and their 14-year-old daughter Barbie. The family members who had been missing for 67 years were finally found, but the circumstances of their discovery confirmed that they had been victims of a brutal crime. The forensic analysis also revealed why Susan and Virginia's bodies had surfaced downstream in May 1959. Unlike their parents and older sister, the two younger girls had been placed in a different part of the car, near a window that had been deliberately broken to ensure the vehicle would sink quickly. When the drilling rig disturbed the car's position on the river bottom, it had shifted the vehicle enough to allow the girls' remains to escape through this opening and float to the surface. But the most shocking discovery came when investigators finally processed the decades-old handgun that had been found near the abandoned stolen car in 1958. Modern DNA analysis revealed blood traces that matched not only the Martin family members but also Roy Light, the ex-convict who had been arrested the day after the family's disappearance. The gun that had seemed like a puzzling coincidence was actually the murder weapon, and its connection to Donald Martin had been a deliberate attempt to frame the surviving family member. As the full scope of the crime became clear, investigators began to understand how Roy Light and his unnamed accomplice had carried out one of the most heinous family murders in Oregon history. The two criminals had encountered the Martin family at the Paradise Snack Bar in Hood River, possibly overhearing conversations about their plans to gather greenery in remote areas along the Columbia River. Following the family to an isolated location, Light and his partner had ambushed them, likely with the intention of robbery. The handgun stolen from Maya and Frank department store, the same gun that Donald Martin had been accused of taking, had been acquired by the criminals specifically to implicate him in his family's murder. It was a diabolical plan designed to eliminate witnesses while framing an innocent man. The murder scene, investigators now believed, had been somewhere along the Columbia River where the family had stopped to gather Christmas greenery. The criminals had shot Kenneth, Barbara, and Barbie Martin, then placed their bodies in the family's car along with the two younger girls, who may have been unconscious or already dead from the trauma of witnessing their family's murder. The car had then been driven to the cliff near the Dalles, where tire tracks had been found in 1959. But rather than simply pushing the vehicle over the edge, Light and his accomplice had taken time to stage the scene. Windows were broken to ensure rapid sinking, the car was positioned to look like an accident, and the stolen handgun was disposed of near their own abandoned vehicle to create a trail of evidence that would confuse investigators. The plan had worked almost perfectly. For 67 years, the crime had been hidden beneath the waters of the Columbia River, and the criminals had escaped justice. Roy Light had died years earlier, taking his secrets to the grave. His accomplice, never identified despite extensive investigation, had also presumably escaped accountability for his role in the murders. The revelation that the Martin family had been victims of premeditated murder rather than a tragic accident sent shockwaves through Oregon and beyond. The case that had been a source of speculation and mystery for generations was finally solved, but the solution was far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. A family's innocent Sunday outing had turned into a nightmare of violence that had been carefully concealed for more than half a century. The impact of these discoveries extended far beyond the immediate investigation. Families across the Pacific Northwest were forced to confront the reality that such senseless violence could strike anyone, anywhere. The Martin family had done nothing wrong, made no dangerous choices, and encountered no extraordinary circumstances. They had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, crossing paths with criminals who saw them as easy targets. The forensic evidence also vindicated investigators like Detective Walter Graven, who had insisted for decades that the family had been murdered. Graven's intuition about the case had been correct, even though he lacked the technology and evidence needed to prove his theories. His dedication to the case, maintained until his death in 1988, represented the best traditions of law enforcement, never giving up on victims even when the odds seemed impossible. Sheriff Rupert Gilmouth's theory about the drilling rig dislodging the car had also proven partially correct. The rig's disturbance of the river bottom in May 1959 had indeed caused Susan and Virginia's bodies to surface, providing the first concrete evidence that something terrible had happened to the family. But the discovery of the full truth revealed that the tragedy had been even worse than anyone had imagined. The news of the solved case spread rapidly through social media and traditional news outlets, generating international attention. The story of a family murder finally solved after 67 years captured public imagination. But it also raised disturbing questions about how many other cold cases might involve similar crimes that remain hidden and unsolved. For the Portland community, the resolution of the Martin case brought a mixture of closure and renewed grief. Many residents who had followed the case for decades were relieved to finally know what had happened to the family, but the brutal reality of their murders was difficult to accept. The innocent Sunday drive that had become part of local folklore was revealed to have been a carefully planned execution. The empty house at 1715 NE 56th Avenue, which had stood as a monument to the missing family, took on new significance as the site where 5 people had spent their last normal morning together. The breakfast dishes that Barbara Martin had left on the drying rack, the laundry she had started in the washing machine, and the Christmas decorations she had been preparing all became poignant reminders of lives cut short by senseless violence. Religious communities that had prayed for the family's safe return and later for justice in their deaths found themselves grappling with complex theological questions about divine protection and human evil. The Martin family had been faithful churchgoers who lived moral, upstanding lives. Their brutal murder challenged comfortable assumptions about virtue being rewarded and evil being punished. The case also highlighted the evolution of forensic science over the past 67 years. The evidence that had puzzled investigators in 1958 became clear and compelling when examined with modern techniques. DNA analysis, computer modeling, and advanced materials science had transformed what was possible in criminal investigations, offering hope that other cold cases might also be solved with new technology. But the Martin case also demonstrated the limitations of even the most advanced forensic techniques. While investigators could now prove how the family had died and identify their killers, they could not bring justice to the perpetrators who had escaped accountability for their crimes. Roy Light had died years earlier, and his accomplice remained unidentified despite extensive efforts to determine his identity. The psychological impact of finally solving the case extended to amateur investigators and true crime enthusiasts who had studied the Martin disappearance for years. Many had developed their own theories about what had happened, and the revelation of the true circumstances forced them to reconsider their assumptions about the case and about crime in general. For Archer Mayo, the diver whose persistence had led to the discovery of the car, the solution of the case represented both triumph and tragedy. His determination to find answers where others had failed had finally brought the truth to light, but that truth was far darker than he had hoped. The family he had worked so hard to find had been brutally murdered, their bodies hidden in the depths of the Columbia River for nearly 7 decades. The recovery of the Martin family's remains also raised practical questions about their final disposition. Kenneth, Barbara, and Barbie Martin were finally returned to their family after 67 years underwater, but there was no surviving family to make decisions about their burial. Donald Martin, who had died in 2004, had been the last member of their bloodline. Their extended family and friends from 1958 were also largely gone, leaving authorities to determine how to respectfully handle their remains. The decision was made to bury the three recovered family members together in a ceremony that honored both their lives and their tragic deaths. The burial site was chosen to allow for future interment of Susan and Virginia Martin, whose cremated remains had been mysteriously retrieved in 1969 and never seen again. The hope was that whoever had taken the girls' ashes might come forward and allow the family to be reunited in death. The funeral service for Kenneth, Barbara, and Barbie Martin drew hundreds of mourners, including many who had never known the family personally but had been touched by their story. The ceremony represented not just a farewell to three murder victims, but a closure to one of Oregon's most enduring mysteries. Speakers at the service emphasized the family's love for each other and their excitement about the Christmas season that had been tragically cut short. The media coverage of the funeral and the solved case generated renewed interest in other cold cases from the same era. Investigators across the country began re-examining unsolved disappearances and murders from the 1950s and 1960s, wondering if modern forensic techniques might provide similar breakthroughs. The Martin case had demonstrated that even decades-old crimes could be solved with persistence and new technology. But perhaps the most profound impact of solving the Martin case was on how people thought about family safety and the randomness of violence. The Martin family had been living ordinary lives, making normal decisions and pursuing innocent activities when they encountered unimaginable evil. Their story served as a reminder that tragedy can strike anyone, anywhere, regardless of precautions or good intentions. The case also highlighted the importance of never giving up on victims of unsolved crimes. For 67 years, the Martin family had been missing, their fate unknown and their killer unpunished. The persistence of investigators, journalists, and amateur sleuths had eventually brought the truth to light and provided a measure of justice, even if criminal prosecutions were no longer possible. As the investigation officially closed in late 2025, the Martin family case entered a new phase as a solved, but still tragic chapter in Oregon history. The mystery that had puzzled generations was finally resolved, but the human cost of the crime remained heartbreakingly clear. 5 innocent people had lost their lives to senseless violence, leaving behind only questions and grief that had lasted for nearly 7 decades. The Columbia River, which had hidden the family's remains for so long, continued its ancient journey to the sea. But now it carried with it not just the secrets of the past, but also a sense of resolution and justice long delayed. The river that had concealed a terrible crime had finally revealed the truth, allowing a family to rest in peace and a community to find closure. Educational institutions began incorporating the Martin case into their curricula as an example of how forensic science and investigative persistence could solve even the most challenging cold cases. Law enforcement academies used the case to illustrate the importance of preserving evidence and never abandoning hope, even when years or decades pass without progress. The house at 1715 NE 56th Avenue, which had stood empty and eventually been demolished, was memorialized with a small park dedicated to the Martin family. The park featured a plaque telling their story and emphasizing the importance of family, community, and the pursuit of justice. It became a place where people could reflect on the fragility of life and the endurance of hope. But there was one final twist to the Martin family story that would emerge only as investigators were preparing to close the case permanently. Among Donald Martin's personal effects, which had been stored in Hawaii after his death in 2004, investigators found a letter that had never been opened. The letter was addressed to Donald and postmarked December 29, 1969, the same day his grandmother had died and the day before his sister's cremated remains had been mysteriously retrieved. The letter, when finally opened by investigators in 2025, contained a confession from an elderly woman who identified herself only as a friend of your family. The woman wrote that she had taken Susan and Virginia's ashes from the mausoleum because she could not bear the thought of the girls remaining unclaimed and alone. She had kept their remains in her own home for years, treating them with the love and respect they deserved. The letter explained that the woman had been a neighbor of the Martin family and had watched the girls grow up. When their bodies were discovered and later cremated, she had felt compelled to care for them in death as she had watched over them in life. She had taken the urns intending to eventually reunite them with their family, but as years passed and hope faded, she had simply kept them as a sacred trust. The letter concluded with instructions for finding the girls' remains, hidden in the woman's former home in southeast Portland. When investigators followed these directions, they found the urns exactly where the letter indicated, carefully preserved and surrounded by flowers and mementos that showed the love and care with which they had been tended. The discovery of Susan and Virginia's remains allowed for the final reunion of the Martin family. In a ceremony that drew even larger crowds than the first funeral, all 5 family members were finally laid to rest together. The service featured readings from letters and diary entries that had been found among Donald's possessions, sharing memories and expressions of love that brought the family's personalities to life for those who attended. The identity of the mysterious woman who had cared for the girls' remains was never definitively established, as she had apparently died years before her letter was discovered. But investigators found evidence suggesting she had been Margaret Miller, an elderly neighbor who had lived near the Martin family and who had been known for her kindness to local children. Margaret had died in 1995, taking her secret with her, but leaving behind a final act of compassion that allowed a family to be reunited in death. The complete resolution of the Martin family case, including the recovery of all 5 family members' remains, marked the end of one of the longest-running missing persons investigations in American history. From the initial disappearance in 1958 to the final burial in 2025, the case had spanned 67 years and touched countless lives. The story of the Martin family became a testament to the power of persistence, the importance of never giving up on victims of unsolved crimes, and the incredible advances in forensic science that had made the solution possible. But it also served as a sobering reminder of the random nature of violence and the way that a single moment can change everything for a family. As Oregon and the nation reflected on the Martin family case, many found themselves thinking about their own families and the precious nature of ordinary moments together. The Martin family's last morning, preparing for a simple Sunday drive to gather Christmas greenery, had seemed so normal and innocent at the time. It was a reminder to cherish family time and never take for granted the people we love. The Columbia River Gorge, where the Martin family had planned to create happy Christmas memories, remained a popular destination for families from Portland and beyond. But for many visitors, the area now carried an additional significance as the place where 5 innocent people had encountered unthinkable evil. Memorial plaques and interpretive signs told their story, ensuring that their memory would be preserved for future generations. In the end, the Martin family's legacy was not just as victims of a brutal crime, but as symbols of resilience, hope, and the enduring power of love. Their story had brought a community together in search and mourning, had inspired decades of dedication from investigators and volunteers, and had ultimately demonstrated that truth and justice, while sometimes delayed, could eventually prevail. The case also highlighted the importance of preserving evidence and maintaining hope in cold cases. The tire tracks found in 1959, the paint chips analyzed by the FBI, and even the controversial observations about possible bullet wounds in the girls' heads had all contributed to the eventual solution. Modern investigators were reminded that even the smallest details from decades past could become crucial evidence with new technology. As the Martin family was finally laid to rest together in 2025, their story became a completed chapter in Oregon's history rather than an ongoing mystery. The questions that had haunted the Pacific Northwest for 67 years were finally answered, though the answers were more tragic than anyone had hoped. But there was comfort in knowing that the family was together again and that their killers had been identified, even if justice in the traditional sense was no longer possible. The children who had attended school with Barbie, Virginia, and Susan Martin were now elderly themselves, many having lived entire lifetimes while wondering what had happened to their classmates. For these survivors, the resolution of the case brought a complex mixture of closure and renewed sadness. They could finally grieve properly for friends whose fate had been unknown for so long, but they also had to confront the brutal reality of how those friends had died. Teachers who had marked the Martin girls absent on December 9, 1958, and who had spent decades wondering about their missing students, found validation in learning that their concerns and memories had been important parts of a larger story of justice delayed but ultimately served. Their classroom attendance records had become part of the historical record that helped establish the timeline of the family's disappearance. The Martin family case ultimately became a story about more than just one family's tragedy. It became a testament to the power of community, the importance of never giving up hope, and the incredible potential of human persistence combined with advancing technology. The case had been solved not by a single breakthrough, but by the accumulated efforts of dozens of people over nearly 7 decades. From the original investigators who carefully preserved evidence with limited resources, to the journalists who kept the story alive in public memory, to the amateur investigators